You are now tuned in to the Triple Threat Podcast.
Well, welcome back to another edition of Triple Threat Podcast. My name is Ken Triplett, and usually I'm with my partner in crime, Jordan Triplett, but he is not here today. He's got the week off celebrating the new year. And Happy New Year, by the way. Happy 2020 to everybody listening to the podcast, all of our loyal listeners. Thank you so much for being with us once again as we discuss the Buffalo Bills and their second playoff appearance in 3 years under Sean McDermott, who is everybody's Coach of the Year candidate, definitely mine, definitely everyone in Bills Mafia Nation. And let's talk about that for a minute. Let's talk about what it means to be Coach of the Year. What criteria should people be using to discuss what that award actually means? If you really think about it, there's been like the early front runner was Mike Tomlin, and everybody was so impressed that he finished 8-8 with a third/fourth string quarterback, however you want to cut it, and which was impressive. I think he is second behind McDermott in terms of the achievements that they had this year, because it's hard to win in the NFL, especially when you go through quarterbacks the way he did. But it's not like he had a huge rash of injuries on his defense or on his offensive line. Other key areas where football is truly won, which is in the trenches. And, I just don't think it's worthy of being Coach of the Year. I think it's impressive, but it just doesn't do enough. When you think about Coach of the Year, guys, look at Sean McDermott's resume. Last year, this team was 6-10 with a rookie quarterback. Coming into this year with a second-year quarterback who did improve. Obviously, we're talking about Josh Allen. And the expectations for this team was, about the same. It was about 7-9 or, 8-8 types of expectations. I know myself, even though the schedule was easy, I looked at it and I said, you know what? I think if things don't go well, if they have a huge rash of injuries, that this team would be 7-9/8-8. But if they got off to a good start and the first two games were key, which happened to be both on the road, which was the anomaly that we all know against the Jets and the Giants. But it was like, you know what? If they could somehow win these two games, then they're looking at Cincinnati, and then they're looking at, other winnable games. And you're like, you know what? They could really come out the gate flying if things go their way. And you know what? They did. And it really catapulted the Bills into having a lot of momentum to getting to the 10-6 record that they finished with. And, I figured before this had happened, if that were to happen, that the Bills were looking at, a really good year, a 9-7/10-6 team. And lo and behold, the Bills did finish 10-6 after last week's loss to the Jets in a meaningless game, which I'm going to get to in a minute and get some things off my chest in terms of, coaching philosophy and approach to these types of games. But kudos to the Bills, kudos to Sean McDermott, who, again, is well-deserving of Coach of the Year honors by taking a team that was 6-10 last year, a second-year quarterback, a complete roster overhaul of new faces and new players that you have to mesh. You have to get to work together. You have to get buy-in from new faces and new players. He accomplished all of that. And I think that's a loss on a lot of national media members who really just look for stories. And I don't think a lot of media members take the time to look at team by team and the value that each situation brings and each coach brings. They just look for stories and they look for the easy way out. And so, unfortunately, I think you're going to get a lot of votes for Mike Tomlin to win Coach of the Year because that was the story, losing his quarterbacks. And my gosh, they might make the playoffs. Well, they fell on their faces, and they didn't make the playoffs. In fact, Sean McDermott beat the snot out of Mike Tomlin head-to-head on his home turf and gained a playoff spot. So it's an open and shut case for me. There are other candidates out there. Some people are talking about, Doug Peterson with the Eagles, who had a bunch of injuries, and I get it. But we're also talking about a team that was in the Super Bowl, a couple years ago. And did have his starting quarterback for the entire year. I just thought, even despite their injuries at the wide receiver position and other positions, that the Eagles still had enough talent to win a crappy division, that being the NFC East. And, they finally won it. And, but I get why people are saying that Doug Peterson would be a candidate as well. But again, it pales into comparison when you look at the whole picture of what Sean McDermott has done and the reasons behind he should be the NFL's Coach of the Year for 2019. All righty. So, as promised, going back to that Bills and Jets game and their overall approach, I was one in the camp that we should rest as many players as possible. And to some extent, the Bills did that. I still don't know why Josh Allen was in at all. The two series that he played were complete jokes, completely meaningless. They were both 3-and-out series. The play calling was atrocious. I don't see how those two series keep you sharp. I think, if anything, it keeps a bad taste in his mouth, because that's the last thing that he'd done on a football field leading up to this wildcard game, this all-important wildcard game. And I'd rather just sit him completely, have him rest. The Bills did rest as many players, I think, that they think they could as possible, but they could have done some more things. They could have called some guys up from the practice squad. And when Levi Wallace went down, I was livid. I was completely beside myself in terms of the Bills being short-sighted and not resting their two starting quarterbacks. They did rest Tre'Davious White, but I felt like, again, they could have done some preliminary things to rest Levi Wallace as well, because most people were saying, well, you can't rest them all. Well, you can rest the most key players as possible, especially at the cornerback position, where, they are almost quarterbacks on the field. They're standalone items, if you will. And it was a situation where the Bills could have had a little bit more foresight and maybe calling up a player or two from the practice squad and bumping up the starting positions with second and third string backups in order to sit Levi Wallace. But that didn't happen. Thank goodness. It looks like he's going to play this week as of the taping of this show. He did practice today. His ankle is heavily taped. From what I saw, he was moving around pretty well, and it does look like he's going to give it a go. If this were a regular season game, he'd be out a few weeks. He'd be out 2 to 3 weeks at least. But folks, it is the playoffs, and it is probably the most important game that the Buffalo Bills have played since their last Super Bowl appearance. And I don't take that phrase lightly. I think it's even more important than their last playoff appearance a couple of years ago against Jacksonville. I don't, and the reason for that, guys, is that there were no expectations, I should say, in regards to that playoff game against Jacksonville. I think everyone, including the Bills, were just happy, number one, that albatross was off their back of the playoff drought. Tired of hearing about it, tired of just, every time, the Bills haven't been in the playoffs since, 1942. And when that drought ended, it was so much of a relief. I don't have to talk to you guys in Bills Mafia. You know exactly how I felt and how you felt regarding that. But the whole point is that there were really no expectations for the Bills to go into Jacksonville against that defense and win that game. And the offense struggled in that game. We don't have to revisit in terms of what happened, but I think, again, the overall point is that, from the fans and even to the Bills themselves, I think the overall feeling was that they were happy to be there. They were happy to be representative. They did play hard. They did keep it close as best as they could. But face it, folks, at the end of the day, there wasn't much that the Bills could do to, offensively at least, to give them enough chance to really contend for a W in that game. This year is completely different. The expectations are different from the coaches to the players to the fans, to even the national media. And some people are picking the Bills in the national media to win this game against the Houston Texans, and which is a relief in some aspects. I don't think it puts any pressure on the Bills. The Bills can come into this game with an attitude of being the underdog and not having anything to lose. No one outside of Buffalo and a few national media members expects the Bills to go into Houston and win this game. But I think that sets up the Bills nicely for an opportunity to, again, let their defense shine and showcase. Because if they are going to win this game, it's going to have to be led by, obviously, this Bills defense with the offense playing turnover-free football, mistake-free football, solid football. I think that's the recipe for the Bills to take into this game. And obviously, you'll get my prediction at the end of this podcast in terms of the outcome. But I think there are going to be some key matchups that we have to look for in this game. One of those key matchups has got to be Tre'Davious White versus DeAndre Hopkins. Obviously, that's going to be the number one thing that the telecast, when we watch the game, are going to look forward to. There's been some talk, if you will, not necessarily chatter or any kind of bulletin board material, but Deshaun Watson did say that he's not afraid to throw to Tre'Davious White's way. And what do you expect him to say? He's going to throw to DeAndre Hopkins as much as possible because, Hopkins is his guy. He's not going to shy away from Tre'Davious White if he's on Hopkins, 100% of the time or 5% of the time. He's going to go for his guy. So that's nothing surprising that the Texans feel in terms of that matchup. But if Tre'Davious can hold his own against a guy who has had success against the Bills in the past, then the Bills have a really good shot at lots of 3-and-outs against this Texans offense. Deshaun Watson, being an electrifying quarterback that he is, if you can get or neutralize even a guy like Hopkins in their offense, you have a great shot at marginalizing this team's ability to put points on the board. So obviously that's going to be a key matchup for the Bills to watch out for. The next matchup, Deshaun Watson versus Leslie Frazier. Now, let's talk about that for a minute. Deshaun Watson is one of the sharpest quarterbacks in the NFL, not widely reported. The guy knows his stuff. The people at Clemson knew that before the draft, obviously because they spent so much time with him, 4 years or 3 years. Or I don't know if he redshirted or not, but 3 or 4 years at Clemson. And in any event, Deshaun Watson is a guy that if you give him enough time to get set up, to go through his progressions, he's going to pick you apart. And they have the receivers to do it. As far as I know, Kenny Stills is questionable for this week. I think he's going to play, but we don't know how much of a factor he's going to be in this football game. But the Texans, when they're sharp and when they're really buzzing, and Deshaun Watson is really on his game, they can easily put up 30, 40 points a game when they're really rolling. And Deshaun Watson can do that to you. He can embarrass you. So the pressure is really on Leslie Frazier to find ways to marginalize Deshaun Watson, keep him in a pocket, keep him away from spectacular plays to Hopkins and the other receivers on that football team. And it's going to be a chess match, guys. It's going to be a situation where Leslie Frazier is going to have to mix up his coverages, come with some different looks that he hasn't seen yet because it is the playoffs. It's playoff time. And, and maybe even throw a few monkey wrenches in there for him. I have no clue how the Bills are going to approach in terms of coverages or how many times he's going to try to blitz Deshaun Watson. But clearly this is a key matchup, guys, to watch in terms of strategy because it's really all about Deshaun Watson versus Leslie Frazier and the battle of wills in this matchup. Finally, my third major key for this game, the Bills' offensive line, they have to They have to establish a consistent ground game in order to keep the chains moving. Devin Singletary, Frank Gore. And here's my thing with Brian Daboll. He uses the run game like window dressing. And what I mean by that is I don't think there's a concerted effort to ever establish a consistent ground game with this guy and with his play calling. It's almost as if he plays lip service to saying, okay, all right, I've already thrown it 3, 4 times, 5 times in a row. Let's throw a run in here, just to, change it up, change the pace, or to get our guys some carries or whatever the case may be. When you're building a ground game, it's an attitude. And it's an attitude that through your game plan that you filter down to your offensive linemen. And I don't know any offensive lineman that would rather pass protect than run block. They enjoy run blocking much more than they do pass protection. And I'm not sure that Brian Daboll has at all this year has been serious about establishing a ground game or a running game. This is the time to do it. Obviously, you're on the road. Time of possession is important in this game only because of the type of quarterback that you're facing. Deshaun Watson, as you guys know, is no joke. So I would prefer the Bills to really play, even though it's boring, to play a ground chuck kind of game, a ground and pound it. I think the Bills are better off offensively if they can grind out, some sort of 17-13 win or 17-16 win or 20-17 win, whatever the case may be. That's how they're going to have to win this football game. And I think the only way that they do that is by making sure that the running game is consistent, it's established, which can set up Josh Allen for play action, for rollouts, for bootlegs, for opportunities for big plays when needed, especially in the red zone, to get the ball across the goal line. So, that, folks, is my major key that the Bills are going to have to do in terms of winning this football game. All right. Now, before I give my prediction for the Bills and Texans, I want to talk about the other wildcard matchups while we're at it, and I'll give my prediction for the Bills game. So after the Bills game, we have the Titans against the Patriots. A very intriguing matchup. The Titans have been hot as of late. Ryan Tannehill is very familiar with the Patriots and their defense with his days in Miami. He's been playing lights out. The Titans with Derrick Henry, who has been the NFL's rushing champion this year. He's been playing great. And so I think you're going to see the Patriots with a concerted effort to shut down Derrick Henry in that running game. Let's put it this way. If it doesn't happen, the Titans could win this football game, folks, which is very exciting if you're a Bills fan, obviously, because if the Bills win and the Titans win, then that means the Bills go to Kansas City and the Titans will go to Baltimore. And if I had my druthers, I'd rather go to Kansas City for the next game as opposed to Baltimore, in Baltimore for that second game. I know everyone wants another crack at Lamar Jackson. I do too, but I'd rather have it in an AFC Championship game, and obviously I'm way ahead of myself, than a game where, you can go against an opponent that you haven't played yet. There's a little bit of unfamiliarity where you can have an edge or two offensively and defensively. But there's always a chance, you never know, that the Titans could win that game. And if the Bills win in Kansas City, then guess what? You're talking about, and this is completely improbable, but a man can dream. You're talking about an AFC Championship game in Buffalo. And wouldn't that be something? So those are my thoughts. It's just something to think about. It's a dream at this point in time, but it's still possible. So, let's look at and hope for obvious reasons. We don't want the Patriots to win anything, but let's hope that Derrick Henry can really just pound the snot out of the Patriots on that ground game, and the Titans come away with the victory against the Patriots. Now, having said that, I think the Patriots are going to win. It's so hard to win in Foxborough, especially when the Patriots, A, number one, are at home, and B, have come off a really disappointing loss to the Miami Dolphins. Uh, I can't remember the last time the Patriots have lost two in a row, especially at home. Having said that, I think the Patriots win this game, and I think they win it by double digits with kind of a late fourth quarter touchdown to kind of wrap things up in Foxborough. The Vikings at the Saints, intriguing matchup, but I think that the Superdome is going to be way too much for the Vikings in a situation that the Saints just have too much talent for the Vikings. The Vikings have a good defense, but at the end of the day, it's Drew Brees. It's a healthy Saints team, and they've been playing well as of late as well. So I'm going to go with the New Orleans victory in that one. We'll say 27-17 Saints. And then finally, before we get to our Bills prediction, the Seahawks and the Eagles. A lot of people are picking the Eagles for this game, and I just don't see it. I just think the Seahawks are a much better football team than the Eagles. We talked about the Eagles' injuries earlier in this podcast, and I just don't see where the Eagles can pull out an upset, even though they're playing at home in Philadelphia. I think the Seahawks are just the better team. And when it comes to playoff time, the better team typically wins. So I'm going to go with Seahawks 21, Philadelphia 6. All right. Well, finally, we get to the Bills game. The Bills and the Texans for the AFC wildcard matchup, the first one. Ironically, it's the Bills who will kick off the 2020 football season, the first game in 2020, and the first game for this new decade, which I think is cool. And it happens to be your much-loved Buffalo Bills as a part of this. We talked about our key matchups. We talked about some of the things that the Bills have to do to win this game. And, folks, I'm telling you what, I got a feeling. So I'm going to go with your Buffalo Bills to win this game. I think the Bills need to put up at least 20 points to win this football game. And so I'm going to go 23 Buffalo, 20 Houston. Mail it in. Thanks for listening, guys. Triple Threat Podcast, Ken Triplett. Next week, Jordan Triplett will be with us, and we'll talk about the results and the outcome of the wildcard game of the Bills, your Bills, and the Houston Texans. Thanks again for listening. We'll see you next week.